There are moments in history when a civilization no longer belongs entirely to itself, when the borders that once seemed eternal grow soft, when the language of power shifts, and foreign voices echo through halls built by ancestors, when the monuments remain, but the hands that raise them answer to distant kings. Egypt, in the centuries after the New Kingdom's long decline, entered such a time. The great pharaohs of old, builders of pyramids, conquerors of distant lands, had passed into memory. The unity that once bound the Nile from the delta to the cataracts had fractured, reformed, and fractured again. The priests of Amun had ruled from Thebes. Libyan chieftains had claimed the double crown. Nubian kings had marched north, calling themselves pharaohs in their turn. And yet the river still rose each year. The fields still turned green. The temples still stood, heavy with incense and whispered prayers. This is the story of Egypt's late period, a name that carries both truth and injustice. Late, yes, in the sense of chronology, but not late in spirit, not late in the quiet endurance of a people who had already survived more centuries than most civilizations would ever know. It begins in the 7th century before the Common Era, in a delta city called Saite, where a new line of rulers looked backward to move forward. It continues through invasion and occupation, through Persian governors and Assyrian armies, through the daily rhythms of farmers who planted and harvested, whether their king spoke Egyptian or not. This is not a story of endings, though endings are here. It is a story of what remains when the center cannot hold, and what a culture preserves when pressed beneath the weight of empire. The Nile remembers everything. The stone does not forget. If these quiet journeys through the past bring you rest, you're welcome to return any time. The city of Sais sat low in the western delta, where the river's many mouths spread toward the sea. It was an old place, older than memory, sacred to Neith, the goddess of weaving, of war, of beginnings that preceded all other beginnings. Her temple rose at the city's heart, and her priests kept records written in scripts so ancient that even scribes in Memphis struggled to read them. In the middle of the 7th century, a man named Psamtik ruled from Sais. He was not the first of his line to hold power there, but he would become the most important. His father and grandfather had governed as local princes under the loose authority of Assyrian overlords, who had swept down from the northeast and shattered Egypt's fragile unity decades before. The Assyrians had appointed governors, extracted tribute, and then largely withdrawn, leaving the delta splintered into rival centers of power. Psamtik understood that Egypt's strength had never come from division. He began quietly. He forged alliances with other delta lords, married into influential families, and hired Greek and Carian mercenaries, foreign soldiers whose loyalty could be bought and who asked no questions about bloodlines or tradition. He moved carefully, consolidating control over one city, then another, never pushing so hard that the other princes would unite against him. By the time the priests of Memphis crowned him pharaoh around 664 BCE, he had already secured the delta. The harder task lay south. Thebes, the ancient southern capital, remained under the control of Nubian princes and the powerful priesthood of Amun. The god's wife of Amun, a royal woman who held immense religious and political authority, governed the city in all but name. Psamtik could not take Thebes by force without tearing Egypt apart again. So he chose another path. He sent his daughter south. Her name was Nitocris, and she was young, perhaps still a child when she made the journey upriver. The arrangement was ancient, a practice stretching back centuries. The reigning god's wife would adopt the daughter of the new pharaoh, training her in the rituals and responsibilities of the office. When the elder woman died, the younger would succeed her. It was a way of binding north and south without war, of ensuring continuity while shifting power. Nitocris arrived in Thebes to ceremony and incense, to hymns sung in the great temple courts. She was dressed in the finest linen, her head shaved in the priestly manner, her hands learning the gestures of ritual. And slowly, over years, her presence in Thebes became Psamtik's presence. The South, proud and ancient, accepted a northern ruler's daughter as its spiritual heart. Egypt, for the first time in generations, began to speak as one kingdom again. Psamtik's reign, now remembered as the 26th dynasty, the Saite period, was marked not by innovation, but by careful, deliberate return. He looked backward, deliberately, to the Old Kingdom and the Middle Kingdom, to the art and architecture and language of Egypt's earlier greatness. Scribes copied texts from pyramid temples built 2,000 years before. Sculptors studied reliefs from the time of the pyramid builders, learning again the proportions and poses that had defined Egyptian art in its first flowering. This was not nostalgia. It was strategy. Egypt's identity had always been rooted in continuity, in the belief that Ma'at, order, balance, truth, was eternal and unchanging. The chaos of recent centuries, the foreign invasions and fractured rule, had shaken that belief. Psamtik's return to older forms was a statement. Egypt endures. Egypt remembers. The disruptions were temporary. The true Egypt, the eternal Egypt, remained. Artisans carved statues in the archaic style, smooth and serene, their faces timeless. Tombs were decorated with scenes that echoed the burial chambers of nobles from the age of the pyramids. Even the language of royal inscriptions shifted, adopting phrases and formulas that had not been used in a millennium. It was a renaissance built on memory. But memory alone does not govern a kingdom. Psamtik also understood the practical demands of his age. Egypt's independence required wealth, and wealth required trade. The Mediterranean world was changing. Greek city-states were rising, establishing colonies along the coasts of North Africa and southern Europe. Phoenician merchants sailed routes that connected the Levant to Spain. New markets, new goods, new alliances. Psamtik opened Egypt to this world cautiously, deliberately. He allowed Greek traders to establish a settlement at Naucratis, a city in the western delta that became a gateway between Egypt and the Greek world. Greek merchants brought wine, olive oil, silver. They took back grain, linen, papyrus. The city thrived, a hybrid place where Egyptian and Greek customs mingled in the markets and docks. Greek mercenaries, too, became a fixture of Egypt's military. They fought in Psamtik's armies, garrisoned his fortresses, and were rewarded with land and status. Some married Egyptian women. Some learned the language. They became part of the fabric of the kingdom, foreigners who served the pharaoh as loyally as any native-born soldier. This was a delicate balance, embracing the foreign without losing the Egyptian. Psamtik managed it by keeping Greek influence contained, controlled. The Greeks lived in their own quarters, worshipped their own gods, but did so under Egyptian authority. They were tools of the state, not threats to it. Psamtik ruled for 54 years. By the time he died, Egypt was stable, prosperous, unified. The southern border with Nubia was secure. The northern cities hummed with trade. The temples were endowed, the priesthoods content. His son, Necho, inherited a kingdom that seemed for a moment to have stepped back from the edge. Necho was ambitious in ways his father had not been. He looked outward, toward empire, toward the great powers of the Near East. He sent expeditions south into Nubia, west into Libya. He ordered a canal dug to connect the Nile to the Red Sea, an engineering project that would allow Egyptian ships to sail directly to the trade routes of the Indian Ocean. He even, according to later accounts, commissioned Phoenician sailors to circumnavigate Africa, a journey that would take 3 years, passing through waters no Egyptian had ever seen. Some of these ventures succeeded, others faltered. Necho's attempt to intervene in the conflicts between Assyria and Babylon ended in disaster at the Battle of Carchemish in 605 BCE, where Egyptian forces were shattered by the Babylonian army. Egypt retreated from the Levant, its ambitions checked, but the kingdom itself remained stable. Necho's successors, Samtikdars, Apries, Amasis, continued the policies of the dynasty. They maintained the balance between tradition and pragmatism, between isolation and engagement. They built temples, commissioned, statues, supported the priesthoods, and they hired more mercenaries, more Greeks, more Carians, because the world beyond Egypt's borders was growing more dangerous. The Saite rulers understood something fundamental about their time. Egypt could no longer dominate through military might alone. The age of imperial expansion of Thutmose III and Rameses II was long past. Survival now required diplomacy, wealth, careful alliances, and yet, beneath the surface, there was fragility. The kingdom's prosperity depended on trade routes that Egypt did not fully control. Its military strength rested heavily on foreign soldiers whose loyalty was bound to payment, not patriotism. The cultural revival, as beautiful as it was, could not erase the reality that Egypt's neighbors, Babylon, Persia, the rising powers of the East, were larger, wealthier, more aggressive. The priests in the temples chanted the old hymns. The farmers along the Nile planted and harvested as their ancestors had for millennia. The artisans carved stone with skill that echoed the old kingdom masters. But the world was shifting, and Egypt, for all its efforts to stand still, to remain eternal, was standing on ground that had begun, almost imperceptibly, to move. The Assyrians came from the east, from the land between the rivers, where cities rose on tell mounds, and kings carved their victories into stone. They did not come all at once. They came in waves, in campaigns that stretched across decades, each one pushing further into the rich lands of the Levant and the Delta. They came with iron weapons and siege engines, with cavalry and chariots, with an army that had conquered nearly everything between the mountains of Anatolia and the Persian Gulf. Egypt had heard of them long before they arrived. Merchants brought stories. Refugees fleeing Syrian cities spoke of walls breached, populations deported, temples looted. The Assyrian kings, Tiglath-Pileser, Shalmaneser, Sargon, ruled an empire unlike anything the world had seen. They governed through terror and efficiency, through calculated brutality and meticulous administration. Conquered peoples were moved from their homelands and resettled elsewhere, breaking bonds of land and kinship that might fuel rebellion. Local rulers were replaced with Assyrian governors. Tribute flowed back to the capital at Nineveh in endless caravans. Egypt, divided and weakened after the collapse of the New Kingdom, watched this empire grow closer. The first serious clash came in the late 8th century, during the reign of the Nubian pharaoh Shabaka. The Nubians, the 25th dynasty, had reunified Egypt from the south, marching down from their kingdom in Kush with armies and ambitions of their own. They saw themselves as Egypt's true protectors, restoring the worship of Amun, rebuilding temples, ruling as pharaohs in the ancient tradition. And they saw the Assyrians as a threat not just to Egypt, but to the entire regional order. When the Assyrian king Sennacherib moved against the rebellious cities of the Levant, Egypt's support for those rebels brought Assyrian attention to the Delta. Sennacherib's army met Egyptian forces somewhere in the borderlands. The accounts are fragmentary, written by victors and survivors with their own reasons for shaping the story. What is certain is that the Assyrians did not conquer Egypt then. They withdrew, perhaps because of disease in their camp, perhaps because the campaign had stretched their supply lines too thin, perhaps because Egypt's defenses proved stronger than expected. But they had reached the edge of the Nile. They had seen its wealth, and they would return. The second wave came under Esarhaddon, Sennacherib's son, in 671 BCE. This time there was no turning back. Esarhaddon's army swept through the Sinai, crossed into the Delta, and pushed toward Memphis. The Nubian pharaoh Taharka, grandson of Shabaka, marshaled Egypt's defenses. There were battles, brief, brutal engagements where Egyptian and Nubian soldiers faced Assyrian veterans hardened by decades of conquest. The Assyrians won. Memphis fell. Taharka fled south to Thebes, then further still back into Nubia. The Assyrians sacked the city, carried off statues and treasures, and installed governors in the Delta. Esarhaddon declared himself king of Egypt, adding the double crown to his long list of titles. But Egypt is not like other lands. It is vast, stretching 700 miles from the Mediterranean to the cataracts. Its cities are separated by desert. Its power centers bound more to the river than to any central authority. An army can take Memphis, can proclaim victory, but holding Egypt requires more than victory. It requires administration, logistics, constant presence. The Assyrians did not have the resources for that. They appointed local rulers, princes from the Delta cities who had either collaborated or been cowed into submission, and tasked them with governing under Assyrian oversight. Tribute was demanded. Garrisons were stationed in key cities, and then the bulk of the army withdrew, marching back east to deal with rebellions elsewhere in the empire. Taharka, waiting in the south, saw his opportunity. He came north again, rallying support, appealing to the anger and humiliation of the occupation. Some of the Delta princes who had sworn loyalty to Assyria wavered or fled, or quietly sent word that they might be persuaded to switch sides. The Assyrian garrisons, isolated and outnumbered, could not hold against a determined Egyptian resurgence. Memphis changed hands again. Esarhaddon, furious, prepared another campaign. But he died before it could be launched, somewhere on the long road back to Egypt. His son, Ashurbanipal, inherited the throne and the war. Ashurbanipal was methodical. He assembled a larger force, planned more carefully, and struck in 667 BCE with overwhelming strength. This time, the Assyrians pushed past Memphis, drove Taharka out of Thebes, and sacked the southern capital with a thoroughness that shocked even Egypt's battle-hardened priests. The temples were looted. Sacred objects, statues of gods, obelisks, ritual vessels, were carried away to Nineveh. The city's wealth, accumulated over centuries of offerings and endowments, was stripped and hauled east in wagon trains that stretched for miles. Thebes, the eternal city, the seat of Amun-Ra, lay broken. Taharqa died in exile in Nubia, his dream of reuniting Egypt under Kushite rule shattered. His successor, Tantamani, made one final attempt to retake the kingdom, marching north with Nubian forces and reclaiming Memphis briefly. But Ashurbanipal's response was swift and merciless. The Assyrians returned, crushed Tantamani's forces, and this time they pursued him all the way to Thebes. They sacked the city again, more thoroughly than before, ensuring that it would not serve as a base for future resistance. Tantamani fled back into Nubia beyond the reach of Assyrian armies and never returned. The Nubian dynasty's rule over Egypt was finished. What followed was not unified rule, but fragmentation under the shadow of empire. The Assyrians did not attempt to govern Egypt directly. They recognized that the costs, military, administrative, financial, would outweigh the benefits. Instead, they relied on a network of local rulers, Delta princes who owed their positions to Assyrian support and who paid tribute in exchange for autonomy. Chief among these was Necho of Sais, father of the Samtik, who would later unify Egypt. Necho governed the western delta, maintaining order, collecting taxes, and sending a portion of Egypt's wealth eastward to Nineveh. He walked a narrow path, keeping his Assyrian overlords satisfied while preserving what autonomy he could for his own city and people. When he died, his son Samtik inherited both his position and his dilemma. But by then, the Assyrian Empire itself was beginning to fracture. Rebellions erupted in Babylon. The eastern provinces grew restless. Ashurbanipal's successors struggled to maintain control over the vast territories their predecessors had conquered. The garrisons in Egypt were recalled or simply abandoned as more pressing threats emerged closer to the Assyrian heartland, and Samtik, watching, waiting, recognized the moment. He began to assert independence, not through open rebellion but through quiet consolidation. He stopped sending tribute. He expanded his influence into neighboring cities. He hired mercenaries to strengthen his forces. And when no Assyrian army came to stop him, he moved to unite Egypt under his rule. The Assyrians, consumed by their own collapse, barely noticed. The scars of the Assyrian invasions ran deep. Thebes never fully recovered. It remained a religious center, a city of temples and priests, but its political power was broken. The wealth that had made it Egypt's greatest city for over 1,000 years was gone, carried off to Nineveh or lost in the chaos of war. The Delta cities, by contrast, grew in importance. Memphis, Sais, Tanis. These became the new centers of power, closer to the Mediterranean trade routes, more connected to the wider world. The shift was subtle, but permanent. Egypt's center of gravity moved north. The Assyrian occupation also changed how Egypt saw itself in relation to foreign powers. For centuries, Egypt had been the dominant force in its region, the empire that others feared and envied. The New Kingdom pharaohs had marched into Syria and Nubia as conquerors, confident in their superiority. But the Assyrians had shattered that confidence. They had proven that Egypt could be invaded, defeated, occupied, that its wealth could be taken, that its gods could not protect it from sufficiently determined enemies. This knowledge, bitter and inescapable, shaped the strategies of the Saite pharaohs. They fortified their borders. They hired foreign soldiers. They pursued diplomacy as carefully as earlier pharaohs had pursued conquest. They understood that Egypt's survival now depended not on dominating the world, but on navigating it wisely. And yet, even in the midst of invasion and fragmentation, daily life along the Nile continued. Farmers still woke before dawn to tend their fields. Fishermen cast nets into the river's brown water. Potters shaped clay on wheels turned by foot. Weavers worked their looms. Scribes copied administrative records in neat hieratic script. The great events of kings and empires, the battles, the sieges, the sackings, touched these lives only intermittently. A garrison quartered in a village, a demand for extra grain to feed soldiers, a son conscripted into a Delta Lord's army and never seen again. But the rhythms of the agricultural calendar, the flooding and planting and harvest, continued regardless of who claimed the title of pharaoh. The river rose, the fields greened, the cycle turned. Egypt endured not because of its kings, but because of its people, because of the countless ordinary men and women who carried on, who planted and built and wove and raised children, who kept the old festivals and spoke the old prayers, who preserved the culture even when the state could not. This was the quiet strength that no conqueror could fully break. The Persians came not as raiders, but as inheritors. By the middle of the 6th century before the Common Era, a new power had risen in the east, greater than Assyria, more organized than Babylon. The Achaemenid Empire, forged by Cyrus the Great, stretched from the Aegean Sea to the borders of India. It was an empire of roads and couriers, of provincial governors called satraps, of systems designed to extract wealth and maintain order across distances that would have broken earlier kingdoms. Egypt, under the later Saite pharaohs, watched this empire grow with the same unease it had felt watching the Assyrians decades before. The last truly independent pharaoh of the 26th dynasty was Amasis, a former general who had seized power through a military coup around 570 BCE. He ruled for 44 years, maintaining Egypt's prosperity through careful diplomacy and trade. He strengthened ties with Greek city-states, welcomed Greek merchants and mercenaries, and tried to position Egypt as a valuable ally rather than a target for conquest. But when Amasis died in 526 BCE, his son Psamtik III inherited a kingdom that had run out of time. Cambyses II, son of Cyrus, had already conquered Babylon. He had secured Persia's western flank, subdued the Ionian Greeks, and turned his attention to the one wealthy, prestigious kingdom that remained outside Persian control: Egypt. Cambyses assembled his forces in the Levant, gathering soldiers from across the empire. Persians, Medes, Babylonians, even Greek mercenaries who fought for Persian gold. He moved methodically, securing supply lines, establishing bases, preparing for a campaign into terrain his armies had never fought in before. The invasion came in 525 BCE. Psamtik III, young and untested, marched his army to Pelusium, the fortress city on Egypt's northeastern frontier where the desert met the delta. It was the traditional gateway into Egypt, the choke point that had to be held if the kingdom were to be defended. The Ai battle was brief and decisive. Persian archery, disciplined and devastating, broke the Egyptian lines. Persian cavalry exploited the gaps. The mercenaries on both sides fought hard, but the Persians had more of them and better command. By the end of the day, Egypt's army was shattered, fleeing back toward Memphis. Psamtik retreated to the capital, hoping to rally defenders, to hold the city long enough for reinforcements or miracles. Neither came. Memphis fell after a short siege. Psamtik was captured, taken in chains, and eventually executed, though the details vary in the telling, shaped by Greek historians who wrote centuries later with their own biases and imaginations. Egypt, after more than 3,000 years of native rule, interrupted, fractured, but never wholly extinguished, became a province of Persia. Cambyses took the title of pharaoh. He was crowned in Memphis according to Egyptian ritual, dressed in the regalia of the double crown, his name inscribed in hieroglyphs within a cartouche. Persian sources later claimed he honored Egyptian gods, made offerings at their temples, presented himself as a legitimate successor to the ancient kings. Egyptian sources, written later and colored by resentment, told a different story. They claimed Cambyses mocked Egyptian religion, killed the sacred Apis bull, desecrated temples. These accounts may be exaggerations, propaganda composed by priests who resented foreign rule, or they may contain truth. Memory is a complicated thing, shaped as much by what people felt as by what actually occurred. What is certain is that Egypt became a satrapy, the sixth satrapy in the Persian administrative system, governed by officials appointed from Susa or Persepolis, taxed according to Persian needs, integrated into an empire that stretched further than any Egyptian pharaoh had ever dreamed of ruling. And yet the Persians were pragmatic rulers. They understood that Egypt's wealth came from its agricultural productivity, from the annual flooding of the Nile and the labor of millions of farmers who had worked this land for generations. Disrupting that system served no purpose, so the Persians largely left the local administration intact. Egyptian scribes still recorded tax assessments in Demotic script. Local governors, many of them from old Egyptian families, continued to oversee their districts. Priests maintained the temples, conducted rituals, managed the vast estates that had been endowed by earlier pharaohs. Daily governance looked much as it had under native rule, except that the taxes now flowed to Persia, and the ultimate authority rested with the satrap in Memphis, who answered to the great king in his distant palace. The burden of taxation was heavy. Egypt, rich in grain and gold, in linen and papyrus, was expected to contribute significantly to the empire's coffers. Ancient sources claim the sixth satrapy paid 700 talents of silver annually, plus the cost of feeding. A Persian garrison of tens of thousands of soldiers. Whether these figures are accurate or inflated, the principle is clear. Egypt was valuable precisely because it could be exploited. The grain ships that once traded with Greek cities now sailed to Persian ports. Egyptian gold helped pay for Persian military campaigns in Greece, in Central Asia, wherever the empire needed resources. Craftsmen, stoneworkers, metalworkers, scribes skilled in ancient arts, were sometimes requisitioned and sent east to work on royal projects in Persepolis or Susa. Egypt's wealth enriched Persia. And yet, the kingdom did not collapse. The fields were still planted. The irrigation systems were maintained, even improved in some areas. Persian engineers, experienced in managing water across their vast empire, introduced new techniques for canal construction and maintenance. Some of these innovations benefited Egyptian farmers, even if the ultimate goal was to increase yields and, therefore, taxes. Resistance, when it came, was fragmented and short-lived. There were revolts in the western delta, where local chiefs tried to assert independence. There were conspiracies among the priesthoods, who resented foreign oversight and the diversion of temple resources to Persian needs. Greek mercenaries, hired by Egyptian rebels, fought briefly and fiercely before being crushed by larger Persian forces. None of these uprisings succeeded in driving the Persians out. The problem was simple. Egypt, divided for so long before the Saite unification, had never fully developed the centralized military strength necessary to resist an empire like Persia. The Saite pharaohs had relied on diplomacy and mercenaries, precisely because Egypt's own military capacity had atrophied. Now, under occupation, there was no mechanism to mobilize a truly national resistance. The Persians, for their part, responded to rebellion with measured brutality. Leaders were executed. Cities that harbored rebels had their walls dismantled. But wholesale destruction was avoided. Persia wanted a productive province, not a wasteland. Darius the Thircer, who succeeded to the Persian throne after the chaos following Cambyses' death, took a different approach to ruling Egypt. He presented himself as a traditional pharaoh, completing building projects at temples, commissioning inscriptions that praised Egyptian gods, even sending an expedition to explore the western desert and re-establish Egyptian control over oases that had drifted into independence. He ordered the completion of the canal linking the Nile to the Red Sea. The project Necho the Sekun had begun decades earlier, creating a waterway that allowed Persian ships to sail from Egypt to the Persian Gulf without rounding Arabia. This was pragmatism dressed as piety. Darius understood that ruling Egypt required more than military force. It required legitimacy, or at least the appearance of it. If the temples accepted Persian rule, if the priests performed the rituals, and inscribed the king's name alongside those of ancient pharaohs, then the population might accept it too. And to a degree, it worked. The great temples, Karnak, Memphis, Sais, received royal patronage. Inscriptions from this period show Darius making offerings to Amun, to Neith, to Ptah. The priests, dependent on royal endowments for their livelihood and influence, cooperated. They chanted the king's name in the liturgies. They carved his image on temple walls. Whether they believed in his legitimacy or simply recognized the futility of resistance is a question lost to time. For ordinary Egyptians, Persian rule was an abstraction that only occasionally touched their lives directly. A farmer in Middle Egypt, far from Memphis or the Delta garrisons, might go years without seeing a Persian official. His interaction with the empire came through taxes, collected by Egyptian intermediaries, and through the occasional passage of troops along the river road. His grain went to the same storage facilities it always had, managed by the same local administrators, recorded by scribes whose families had held the position for generations. The rhythms of his life, planting, harvest, the flood season when work shifted to maintaining tools and repairing houses, remained unchanged. Artisans in the cities saw more direct Persian influence. Greek and Persian merchants appeared in the markets. Foreign soldiers hired Egyptian craftsmen to make furniture, pottery, jewelry. New styles, new motifs appeared in decorative arts, Persian rosettes, Greek geometric patterns, blending with traditional Egyptian designs. This was not replacement, but layering. Egypt absorbed foreign elements as it always had, incorporating them without losing its own character. A pot might bear Greek-style decoration, but it was still made on an Egyptian wheel from Nile clay by hands trained in techniques passed down through generations. The priests, meanwhile, preserved what they could. They copied ancient texts onto fresh papyrus, maintaining libraries that stretched back to the Old Kingdom. They trained young scribes in hieroglyphics, even though Demotic had become the common script for daily administration. They performed rituals that had been performed for thousands of years, in temples whose foundations were older than any living memory. This was resistance of a sort, not armed rebellion, but cultural endurance. By maintaining the old forms, the old knowledge, the priests ensured that Egypt remained recognizably Egyptian, even under foreign rule. they were the keepers of continuity, the living link to ancestors who had built the pyramids, who had carved the great temples, who had established Ma'at as the foundation of all order. The Persians could tax Egypt's wealth. They could appoint governors and station troops. They could demand labor and requisition resources, but they could not erase what Egypt had been. The monuments stood. The language endured. The gods remained in their temples, receiving offerings, speaking through oracles, binding the present to an unbroken past. Persian rule over Egypt lasted, with interruptions, for more than a century. There were periods of rebellion, brief windows when Egyptian leaders managed to drive the Persians out and restore native rule. The most successful was in the 4th century, when a series of Egyptian dynasties, the 28th, 29th, and 30th, held power for several decades, fighting off Persian attempts at reconquest. But in 343 BCE, the Persians returned under Artaxerxes III, crushing the last native pharaoh and reimposing imperial control. This second Persian occupation was harsher than the first. There was less pretense of legitimacy, less patronage for temples, more naked extraction of resources. Egypt, by then, was simply a province to be exploited. Its wealth needed to fund wars against the Greeks and to hold together an empire that was itself beginning to fracture. The priests stopped inscribing Persian kings' names with the same reverence they had shown Darius. The population, weary of occupation, waited for another change. They did not have to wait long. The river did not care who called himself pharaoh. It rose each summer as it always had, swelling with distant rains from mountains no Egyptian had ever seen, carrying rich silt northward to spread across the valley floor. The water climbed the measuring stones at the nilometers, watched by priests who recorded the levels and calculated what the harvest might be. Too low, and famine threatened. Too high, and villages drowned, their mud brick walls dissolving into the flood. The right height meant survival, meant another year. For the farmers who worked the black soil of Egypt, this cycle mattered more than any distant king. They lived by the calendar of the inundation, the season of emergence when the waters receded and planting began, the season of harvest when the grain grew tall and golden under the relentless sun. Their days began before dawn, when the air was still cool and the eastern sky showed only the faintest gray. A man would rise from his sleeping mat, perhaps wake his sons if they were old enough to help, and walk to the fields that his family had worked for generations. The land might technically belong to a temple or a nobleman or the state, but in practice it belonged to those who knew its moods, its wet corners and dry patches, where the soil was richest and where it needed more manure. The tools were simple, unchanged for centuries. A wooden plow, sometimes tipped with bronze if the farmer could afford it, pulled by oxen that moved slowly through the soft earth. A hoe for breaking up clumps of soil. A sickle for cutting grain at harvest time, its flint teeth still sharp though metal blades were becoming more common among those who could trade for them. The work was backbreaking. Hour after hour of bending, lifting, carrying. The sun climbed and beat down on bare shoulders. Sweat dried white on dark skin. Hands developed calluses that cracked and bled, then hardened again. But there was rhythm to it, a steadiness that made the days pass. A man worked alongside his neighbors, their fields adjacent, their conversations flowing easily across the low boundaries of turned earth. They shared advice about which seeds seemed stronger this year, which plots were being troubled by insects, where a canal needed clearing to ensure proper drainage. This knowledge was survival. It passed from father to son, from experienced farmer to young apprentice, in demonstrations rather than words. How to read the soil's moisture by its color. How to judge when grain was ready for harvest by the weight of the stalk. How to store seed so it would remain viable until the next planting. Women's work followed its own patterns, equally essential, equally demanding. A woman rose with her husband, prepared a simple morning meal. Bread, perhaps some onions, beer left from the previous day's brewing. She sent her children to fetch water from the canal if they were old enough to manage the heavy jars, or carried it herself if they were too young. Water for drinking. Water for cooking. Water for washing. Though washing was a luxury reserved for festival days or special occasions when clean linen mattered. She ground grain into flour, a task that never ended. The grinding stones, a flat base and a rounded upper stone, required strength and patience. She would kneel, pressing down and forward, crushing the grain in small batches. The sound of stone on stone, a constant rhythm in the courtyard. The flour was never perfectly smooth. Tiny fragments of stone worked their way into it, wearing down teeth over the years, giving even young adults the worn molars of people twice their age. Bread baked in outdoor ovens, round loaves that formed the foundation of every meal. Beer brewed in large jars, thick and nutritious, safer to drink than water that might be tainted. These were the staples, supplemented by what could be grown in small kitchen gardens: onions, garlic, lentils, cucumbers, or caught in the river and canals. Children worked, too, as soon as they could walk steadily. Small hands chased birds away from newly planted fields, waving sticks and shouting. Older children minded younger siblings, carrying infants on their hips while their mothers worked. Boys learned their father's trades, whether that was farming or fishing, or pottery or carpentry. Girls learned from their mothers, cooking, weaving, the management of household resources that made the difference between comfort and hunger. There was little formal schooling, except for the few boys whose families could afford to send them to temple schools, where they might learn to read and write and calculate, where they might become scribes and escape the endless physical labor of agricultural life. Most children never learned to read. They learned instead the practical knowledge of their parents' work, the skills that would sustain them and their own children when the time came. Play happened in the spaces between work. Children fashioned toys from whatever was at hand: rag dolls, balls made from bundled papyrus, small boats to float in irrigation canals. They ran and shouted and invented games, their laughter a bright sound against the quiet seriousness of adult labor. They did not know that these were years of foreign occupation, that their kingdom had lost its independence. Such things were abstractions, the concerns of people far away. What mattered was the immediate world, the canal that needed to be kept clear, the bread that needed to be baked, the small daily victories and setbacks that shaped a life. In the towns and cities, life took different forms, but followed similar rhythms. Craftsmen rose early to work in workshops that often occupied the ground floors of their homes. A potter shaped clay on a wheel turned by an apprentice, his hands moving with practiced sureness as bowls and jars and storage vessels took form. He would produce dozens in a day, each one similar but not identical, each bearing the subtle marks of individual creation. The vessels dried in the sun, then were fired in kilns whose temperatures had to be managed carefully. Too hot and they cracked, too cool, and they remained fragile. The knowledge of how to build the fire, when to add fuel, when to let it die down, this came from years of experience, of failures and successes, of watching one's master and learning not just what to do, but why. Nearby, a weaver worked at a loom, threads stretched tight, her shuttle moving back and forth in a pattern she had memorized so thoroughly that her hands needed no conscious direction. She might be making rough linen for workers' clothing, or fine linen for someone wealthy. The threads counted so carefully that the finished fabric would be nearly transparent. The better the linen, the higher the price. And price mattered, because craftsmen worked for payment, in grain, usually, measured out by scribes who recorded every transaction, who maintained accounts that went back years, tracking debts and credits in the careful script of daily commerce. Markets gathered in the morning, in open squares or along the riverfront, wherever space and custom had established a trading place. Fishermen brought their catch, still fresh from the early morning nets, perch, catfish, tilapia, displayed on reed mats. Farmers brought vegetables from their gardens, surplus from what their families needed. Merchants offered goods that came from further away, salt from the delta, natron from the desert lakes, honey from hives kept in the marshlands, dates from oases in the western desert. There was no coinage yet. Trade happened through barter, through exchange, through complicated calculations of relative value. A fisherman might trade his catch for bread and onions. A woman might exchange her woven cloth for oil and grain. Scribes sometimes mediated, recording transactions, ensuring fairness, or at least the appearance of it. Voices rose and fell in negotiation. Hands gestured. Disagreements were settled through custom and compromise, rarely through violence. The market was too important, too central to daily survival, to allow conflicts to disrupt it for long. The temples, massive and wealthy, stood at the center of urban life. They were not just places of worship, but economic engines employing thousands. Priests and priestesses, yes, but also farmers who worked temple lands, craftsmen who made ritual objects, scribes who recorded offerings and managed estates, guards who protected the sacred precincts. The daily rituals continued regardless of who ruled Egypt. Each morning before dawn, the high priest would enter the sanctuary, break the seal on the shrine, and awaken the god. He would wash and dress the statue, present offerings of food and drink, chant the proper hymns. This had been done for centuries, for millennia. The exact words, the precise gestures, the proper order of actions, all were recorded in texts copied and recopied, learned by young priests who would someday perform these same rituals for gods who were eternal. The offerings, bread, beer, meat, vegetables, incense, were later redistributed to the temple staff. Nothing was wasted. The gods consumed the spiritual essence. The physical substance fed those who served them. It was an elegant system, binding the sacred and the practical into a single continuous cycle. Festivals broke the routine, bringing color and noise and shared celebration. The great festivals followed the calendar, marking agricultural seasons or commemorating mythological events. The journey of Hathor between temples, the triumph of Horus over Set, the resurrection of Osiris. Processions carried divine statues through the streets. Musicians played. Drummers, flutists, singers who knew the ancient hymns. Dancers moved in patterns that told stories without words. People lined the processional routes, watching, sometimes joining the procession if custom allowed. For a day or several days, work, stopped. Extra food was distributed. Beer flowed more freely. There was laughter, music, a temporary suspension of the usual constraints. These festivals were important not just religiously, but socially. They reinforced community, gave people a shared identity that transcended their individual struggles. They were moments when the ordinary and the sacred touched, when the presence of the gods felt near and real. And they continued, even under Persian rule. The occupiers understood, or at least tolerated, the importance of these festivals. Disrupting them would have risked unrest that military force might not easily contain. Death, when it came, was met with rituals as old as Egypt itself. The wealthy could afford elaborate mummification, expensive spices, ornate coffins, tomb goods that would accompany them into the afterlife. The poor made do with simpler preparations, wrapping the body in linen, placing it in the desert sand where natural desiccation would preserve it, providing whatever small objects the family could spare. But the essential belief was the same across all classes. Death was not an ending, but a transformation. The deceased would journey to the afterlife, would be judged by Osiris, would, if they had lived according to Mahat, join the blessed dead in a realm that mirrored the best of earthly existence. Tombs were houses for eternity. Painted scenes showed the deceased engaged in activities they had enjoyed in life: hunting, feasting, overseeing work in the fields. These images were not mere decoration but magical provisions, ensuring that the dead would have these pleasures forever. Priests performed the opening of the mouth ceremony, rituals designed to restore the deceased's senses so they could eat, drink, see, speak in the next world. Offerings were left: food, drink, incense, and were meant to be renewed regularly by family members or by priests paid to maintain the tomb in perpetuity. In practice, most tombs were eventually abandoned. Families died out or moved away. Endowments ran out. The desert claimed the offerings and the painted images faded under layers of dust. But the belief endured, that life continued after death, that the essence of a person, their ka, their ba, persisted, that Egypt's gods would welcome those who had honored them in life. Through all of this, the farming and crafting, the marketing and temple service, the festivals and funerals, a question hovered, unspoken but present. What did it mean to be Egyptian when Egypt was ruled by foreigners? The answer, worked out in 1,000 small daily choices, was this: you continued. You spoke the language your parents spoke. You worshipped the gods your ancestors worshipped. You learned the skills your family had practiced for generations. You raised your children to do the same. The Persians might collect taxes. They might station soldiers in garrisons. They might appoint governors who spoke a different language and followed different customs. But they could not be everywhere. They could not supervise every field, every workshop, every household. And in the spaces they did not control, Egypt remained Egyptian. A woman teaching her daughter to grind grain was preserving a tradition older than any empire. A priest chanting the morning hymn was maintaining a connection to gods who predated all foreign kings. A farmer planting barley using methods his great-grandfather had taught him was asserting, without words, that some things did not change no matter who claimed dominion. This was not dramatic resistance. It was something deeper, quieter, more enduring. It was survival as an act of defiance. By the middle of the 4th century before the Common Era, Egypt had grown weary. Not the weariness of a single season's hard labor, but the deeper exhaustion that comes from generations of uncertainty. The land had known foreign rule and brief independence, reconquest and rebellion, cycles of hope and disappointment that stretched across decades until they blurred into a pattern that seemed almost inevitable. The Second Persian occupation, reimposed in 343 BCE by Artaxerxes III, felt different from the first. There was less ceremony this time, less pretense that the Persian king was a legitimate pharaoh continuing an ancient tradition. The occupation was administrative, extractive, efficient. Egypt was a province that had rebelled and been brought back into the fold, and it would be governed accordingly. The temples received fewer endowments. The priests found their influence curtailed, their vast estates more closely monitored, their grain stores subject to requisition. Persian. Officials moved through the country with harder eyes, less patience for local customs that complicated tax collection or slowed the movement of resources. The population felt it. Not always directly, not always dramatically, but in the accumulated weight of small impositions. An extra assessment here, a labor conscription there. The gradual sense that the kingdom existed now primarily to serve someone else's needs. Mercenaries had become a fixture of Egyptian life. Greeks, mainly, from the cities of Ionia and the mainland, men who fought for wages and asked no questions about the causes they served. They garrisoned the forts along the borders, patrolled the delta, maintained order in cities where local resentment toward Persian rule sometimes flared into violence. Some of these mercenaries had been in Egypt for years, even decades. They had married Egyptian women, learned enough of the language to conduct daily business, raised children who were neither fully Greek nor fully Egyptian, but something in between. They worshipped their own gods in their own ways, but they also paid respect to Egyptian deities when it seemed prudent, offering at local temples, participating in festivals. In the garrison towns, Greek and Egyptian cultures mixed in ways that would have seemed strange a century earlier. A Greek soldier might have an Egyptian wife who prepared his meals using local ingredients and methods, while he taught their sons to speak Greek and trained them in the hoplite fighting style. The children grew up bilingual, comfortable in both worlds, belonging entirely to neither. This mixing was not peaceful integration exactly. There were tensions, resentments, moments when the differences between occupier and occupied became sharp and painful. But there was also accommodation, the practical recognition that life went on regardless of politics, that people found ways to coexist when the alternative was constant conflict. The Greek presence extended beyond military matters. Merchants from Athens, from Corinth, from the islands, established trading posts in the delta cities. They brought wine and olive oil, silver and fine pottery, goods that wealthy Egyptians desired and could afford. They took back Egyptian grain, linen, papyrus, glass, products that fed Greek cities and filled Greek markets. Naucratis, the old Greek settlement established under the Saite pharaohs, continued to thrive. It was a hybrid place, a city where Greek architectural styles appeared alongside Egyptian temples, where Greek was spoken in the agora, but Egyptian in the surrounding neighborhoods, where the gods of both cultures received worship and offerings. In Naucratis, one could see the future taking shape, though no one at the time would have named it as such. The boundaries between cultures were becoming more permeable. Ideas flowed along with trade goods. Egyptian priests learned Greek to communicate with foreign officials. Greek merchants learned Egyptian to negotiate with local suppliers. This was not yet the Hellenistic age, not yet the thorough blending that would come after Alexander. But the groundwork was being laid. the connections forming, the world growing smaller and more interconnected, whether Egypt wanted it to or not. Meanwhile, to the west, something was stirring. Rumors reached Egypt through the usual channels: merchants, travelers, sailors who had put in at ports along the North African coast. Stories of a young Macedonian king who had consolidated power in the fractious Greek world, who had defeated the combined armies of Athens and Thebes, who spoke of grand ambitions, and carried himself with a confidence that suggested he might actually achieve them. His name was Alexander. Egypt's Persian governors heard these rumors and paid them little mind at first. Macedonia was far away. The Greeks were always fighting among themselves. Their squabbles rarely affected Egypt directly. But the rumors continued, and they grew more specific. Alexander had crossed into Asia. He had defeated a Persian army at the Granicus River. He was moving south along the coast of Anatolia, liberating or conquering, depending on one's perspective, the Greek cities that Persia had controlled for generations. The reports became harder to dismiss. In the villages and towns of Egypt, life continued with the same rhythms it had maintained for generations. Farmers planted and harvested, their concerns focused on the immediate: whether the inundation would be sufficient, whether the taxes this year would leave them enough grain to feed their families through the dry season, whether a son was old enough to help with the plowing or a daughter ready to be married. They heard fragments of news from the north and east, filtered through layers of retelling until the details were uncertain. A battle somewhere, a Persian defeat, a Greek king marching. None of it seemed to touch their lives directly. They had lived through occupations before. They had seen rulers come and go, each one claiming to be the rightful pharaoh, each one eventually replaced by someone else making the same claim. The pattern had repeated so many times that it had become almost meaningless. Whoever ruled from Memphis or Alexandria or distant Persepolis, the river would still flood. The grain would still need to be planted. The bread would still need to be baked. This was the practical wisdom of people who had learned, over long centuries, that survival meant focusing on what you could control and enduring what you could not. The priests, though, watched the political shifts more closely. They understood that changes at the top rippled downward, affecting temple endowments, religious policies, their own influence and security. Under Persian rule, that influence had diminished. The great temples were still wealthy, still important, but they operated under constraints that earlier generations of priests would have found intolerable. Some priests quietly hoped for another change. Not rebellion, they had learned the costs of failed rebellion, but a shift in the greater political currents that might bring a ruler more sympathetic to Egyptian traditions, more willing to patronize the temples in the old manner. Others were more cautious, remembering that change brought uncertainty, and uncertainty could be more dangerous than predictable oppression. They copied their texts, maintained their rituals, and waited. Waiting was something Egyptian priests had grown very good at over the millennia. They thought in terms of generations, of centuries, of cycles that turned slowly but inevitably. The current age of foreign rule would pass as all ages passed. Egypt would endure. The gods were patient. In Memphis, the Persian satrap governed with the wary competence of a man who understood he was sitting on a restless province. He maintained the garrison at full strength. He ensured that tax collection proceeded smoothly, that grain shipments moved north and east to supply Persian armies and cities. He cultivated relationships with the most important Egyptian officials, the local elites whose cooperation made governance possible. rewarding loyalty and punishing disloyalty with calculated precision. He also kept himself informed about events beyond Egypt's borders. Couriers arrived regularly from Persia, bringing news from the imperial capital, instructions from the great king, updates on military campaigns. The news from the west grew increasingly troubling. Alexander had defeated another Persian army at Issus, a more significant victory than the Granicus. He had rejected peace offers from the Persian king. He was moving south through Syria and Phoenicia, besieging cities, accepting surrenders, building momentum, and he was heading toward Egypt. The satrap sent messages to Persepolis, requesting reinforcements, warning that Egypt might be Alexander's next target. He strengthened the garrisons at the border, fortresses, stockpiled supplies, prepared defensive positions. But he also understood, as any experienced administrator would, that Egypt's loyalty to Persia was shallow at best. If Alexander arrived with a large enough army, if he presented himself as a liberator rather than a conqueror, if he made the right promises to the right people, the Persian hold on Egypt might dissolve more quickly than anyone in Persepolis imagined. The satrap was a practical man. He understood power, its sources and its limits, and he understood that sometimes the wise choice was to recognize when the situation had shifted beyond your control. He waited, like everyone else in Egypt, to see what would come from the north. Alexander entered Egypt in 332 BCE. He came not at the head of an invading army, forcing his way through desperate resistance, but almost as a guest. The Persian satrap, assessing the situation with cold clarity, surrendered without a fight. The garrison troops stood down. The fortresses opened their gates. Egypt, exhausted by decades of Persian occupation, welcomed the young Macedonian king with something that looked, from a distance, like enthusiasm. He was crowned pharaoh in Memphis with full Egyptian ritual. The priests, who had resented Persian rule, saw in Alexander a potential patron who might restore their influence and endowments. They performed the ancient ceremonies, spoke the ancient formulas, placed the double crown on his head. Whether they believed in his legitimacy or simply recognized political reality is a question without a clear answer. Perhaps both were true. Perhaps, after so many foreign rulers, the distinction had ceased to matter. What mattered was that Alexander made the right gestures. He honored the Egyptian gods. He consulted the oracle of Amun at Siwa in the western desert, and emerged claiming divine parentage. He founded a new city on the Mediterranean coast, a city that would bear his name and outlive his empire, Alexandria. The late period, as historians would later name it, was ending. Egypt was passing from one form of foreign rule to another, from Persian administration to Macedonian, and then Ptolemaic governance. The change was profound in some ways. New languages, new administrative systems, new cultural influences that would transform Egyptian art and religion and daily life over the coming centuries. But in other ways, the fundamental patterns endured. The river still flooded. The farmers still planted. The temples still stood, their walls thick with hieroglyphs that told stories reaching back to the beginning of time. The gods still received offerings. The dead still journeyed to the afterlife, judged by Osiris according to principles established when the pyramids were young. Egypt had survived the Assyrians. It had survived the Persians. It would survive the Greeks, absorbing them, outlasting them, maintaining something essential even as the surface forms changed again and again. This was Egypt's true strength, discovered over millennia of upheaval and continuity both. not the strength of armies or fortresses, though those had their place, not the strength of kings who came and went like the seasons, but the strength of a culture so deeply rooted, so thoroughly woven into the land itself that no conqueror could fully uproot it. The strength of farmers who planted regardless of who collected the taxes, of priests who maintained rituals older than any living empire, of craftsmen who worked in techniques their ancestors had perfected before history began. The late period had been a time of foreign rule, of instability, of Egypt diminished from its earlier glory. But Egypt had not disappeared. It had bent without breaking. It had endured. And, as Alexander's brief time in Egypt gave way to the Ptolemaic dynasty, as Greek became the language of administration and Greek settlers filled the new city on the coast, Egypt continued. Transformed, yes, but recognizably itself, carrying forward the accumulated weight of 3,000 years into whatever future awaited. The story of Egypt's late period is not a story of endings, though it might seem that way at first glance. It is not the tale of a civilization collapsing, of a culture erased, of monuments crumbling into sand and memory fading into silence. Those endings would come much later if they came at all, and even then they would be incomplete. What the late period represents instead is something more complex and perhaps more human. It is the story of a people learning to survive when the world around them had changed in ways their ancestors could never have imagined. When the certainties that had defined Egyptian life for millennia, the divine right of pharaohs, the invincibility of Egypt's borders, the eternal order of Mahat, had been tested and found wanting. The Assyrians had proven that Egypt could be invaded. The Persians had proven it could be occupied. The fragmentations and reunifications of the Saite period had shown that unity, once broken, was difficult to restore. And yet, the Nile still flowed. There is something profound in that continuity, something worth pausing over as this chapter of Egypt's long story draws to a close. The farmers who woke before dawn to tend their fields during the Persian occupation were doing exactly what their ancestors had done under Ramesses III, under Khufu, under Narmer. The techniques had been refined over generations, yes, but the fundamental relationship between people and land remained unchanged. Plant when the flood recedes. Harvest when the grain is golden. Store enough to survive the next inundation. Pass the knowledge to your children. This was not passive acceptance. It was active preservation, the deliberate choice to maintain what mattered most, even when the larger political structures had failed. The priests who copied ancient texts in temple libraries during times of foreign rule were performing an act of resistance more powerful than any military campaign. They were ensuring that the words of their ancestors, the hymns, the wisdom texts, the funerary rituals, would survive to be read by generations not yet born. They were keeping Egypt alive in the place it had always lived most truly, not in the throne room, not in the battlefield, but in the written word, the spoken prayer, the ritual performed with precision and care. The late period taught Egypt something about itself, that its identity did not depend on having an Egyptian king, that its culture could survive beneath layers of foreign administration, that the monuments and the language and the gods were more fundamental, more enduring than any individual ruler or dynasty. This was a hard lesson. It came at tremendous cost. In wealth extracted through taxation, in autonomy lost to distant empires, in the gradual erosion of Egypt's sense of itself as the center of the world. But it was also, in a strange way, a liberation. If Egypt could survive the Persians, it could survive anything. If the culture could maintain itself through occupation and fragmentation, then perhaps it was more resilient than anyone had realized. Perhaps the true Egypt existed not in palaces but in villages, not in royal decrees but in the daily choices of ordinary people to remain Egyptian in thought and deed and language. When Alexander arrived, Egypt did not resist because, in some sense, it no longer mattered who wore the double crown. The crown was a symbol, and symbols could be transferred, could be claimed by foreigners who learned the right words and made the right offerings. What could not be transferred was the knowledge carried in the hands of a potter shaping clay, in the voice of a priest chanting the morning hymn, in the practiced eye of a farmer judging when the flood had reached the right height. The Ptolemies would rule Egypt for 3 centuries after Alexander. Greek kings with Greek courts speaking Greek in their magnificent new capital on the Mediterranean. They would build libraries and lighthouses, would patronize scholars, would blend Greek and Egyptian traditions in ways that created something new and strange. And beneath all of that, the river would continue to flood. The fields would continue to green. The temples at Karnak and Luxor and Philae would continue to receive offerings, their walls carved with hieroglyphs that told stories in a language the Greek rulers never fully learned. Egypt would absorb the Greeks as it had absorbed others before them, taking what was useful and leaving the rest, maintaining its essential character through adaptation and endurance. There is a question that lingers at the end of the late period, one without a simple answer. When does a civilization end? Is it when foreign armies occupy its cities? When foreign kings claim its throne? When foreign languages replace its own in official documents? Or does it end only when the last person who remembers stops remembering? When the last ritual goes unperformed, the last text unread, the last temple abandoned to silence and sand? By that measure, Egypt did not end in the late period. It did not end under the Ptolemies or even under the Romans who came after. It transformed, certainly. It changed in ways that would have been unrecognizable to the pyramid builders, to Akhenaten, to Rameses the Great. But transformation is not the same as ending. The thread, however frayed, however tangled, remained unbroken. If you have stayed with this story through its telling, through the slow accumulation of centuries and the patient description of lives lived in times of uncertainty, then perhaps you understand what the late period represents. Not glory, not triumph, not the building of monuments that touch the sky or the conquest of distant lands, but something quieter and perhaps more important, the determination to continue, to plant the field even when you do not know who will collect the harvest, to copy the text even when you do not know who will read it, to perform the ritual even when the world outside the temple walls has changed beyond recognition. This is what endurance looks like. Not dramatic resistance, but steady, patient continuation. And it is enough. More than enough. The late period ends, in the conventional telling, with Alexander's arrival and the beginning of the Ptolemaic Age. But endings and beginnings are always somewhat arbitrary, lines drawn by historians to make sense of continuities that do not naturally break. Egypt's story continues beyond this point, through the Ptolemies and the Romans, through the coming of Christianity and Islam, through conquests and transformations that layer over what came before without entirely erasing it. Even today, millennia after the last native pharaoh, Egypt remains. The river still flows. The monuments still stand. weathered but enduring. The language survives in liturgy and scholarship. The memory persists. That is the true legacy of the late period, the proof that a culture rooted deeply enough, carried carefully enough, passed down generation after generation with love and attention and care, can survive almost anything. The pharaohs are gone. The empires that conquered them have also fallen, their own monuments now dust and fragments studied by scholars. But Egypt endures, and perhaps that is the only ending that matters, not an ending at all, but a continuation, a quiet persistence, a refusal to disappear even when disappearance would have been easier. Rest now. The story continues, as it always has, in ways we can trace and ways we cannot, in monuments we can visit and in knowledge we can only imagine, in the eternal flow of a river that has witnessed everything and forgotten nothing. Egypt remembers, and in remembering, it lives.